Have you ever wondered why in the ICU, the first thing doctors do is hook the patient up to an IV drip with saline solution? Not vitamins, not complex antibiotics, but plain physiological saline. And do you know what that is? It's a 0.9% aqueous solution of sodium chloride. In simpler terms, it's salt water. For years, we've been told that salt is white death, that it causes hypertension, deposits in the joints, and kills us from the inside. But if it's poison, why do they infuse this very poison into the veins of a person on the brink of life and death to save that life? Here's one of the most monstrous contradictions of modern medicine and history that we've simply stopped noticing. We've been convinced that a salt-free diet is the path to health. But no one explains why wild animals travel hundreds of miles, risking their lives, to find a salt lick and just lick the salty ground. They know what we've forgotten, or more precisely, what we've been ordered to forget. Let's cast aside school textbooks and look at the facts with the dry eye of an engineer. The human body is not just a set of bones and meat. It's a complex biochemical machine that runs on electricity. Every heartbeat of yours, every finger movement, every thought flashing through your head is an electrical impulse. Neurons transmit signals, muscles contract only due to potential differences. And now, a trick question from high school physics that you probably skipped. What is needed for current to flow through a liquid? An electrolyte. Distilled water doesn't conduct electricity. If you replace a person's blood with pure water without impurities, they will die instantly because the electrical circuit of their body will break. Sodium, which we get from salt, is the main ion in extracellular fluid. It is precisely responsible for generating electrical potentials in cells. Without salt, we don't just become lethargic, we turn into switched-off devices. Cyborgs with dead batteries.
And here's where it gets really interesting. If salt is so vitally necessary that without it the body simply shuts down, it becomes clear why in ancient times it was treated completely differently than now. We're told that salt was valued as much as gold because it was the only preservative. Supposedly, people didn't know how to store meat and fish otherwise, and that's why they were ready to kill for a sack of white crystals. Sounds logical for a fifth-grade textbook, but let's turn on critical thinking. Salt lies literally under our feet. The world's oceans, which cover most of the planet, are a giant saltwater solution. Salt domes and mines are scattered across all continents. Extracting salt by evaporating it from seawater is technologically simpler than smelting iron or building an aqueduct. It's the simplest operation, accessible even to primitive man. So why was it so expensive? Why did it spark riots, topple governments, and redraw state borders? Recall the famous Salt Riot in Moscow in 1648. Official history tells us that Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich introduced a salt tax, prices skyrocketed, and the people revolted. But think about it. People took to the streets, trashed boyar mansions, and demanded officials' heads, not over bread, not over land, but over a food additive? Historians want to convince us that the Russian peasant, accustomed to hardships and deprivations, was ready to go to the scaffold just so his soup could be saltier? That's absurd. Riots of that scale only erupt when something is taken away from people, without which physical survival is impossible. If salt is just a flavor enhancer or preservative, you can get by without it. You can dry meat, cure fish in the wind, use honey or ash. But if salt is fuel for the nervous system, its deficiency causes mass psychosis, weakness, loss of will, and slow, agonizing death. The powers that be of those times understood perfectly. Whoever controls salt supplies holds the switch that manages the population's energy. Look at the etymology. The English word salary, which means wages, comes from the Latin word salarium. To Roman legionaries, the most powerful war machines of antiquity, part of their pay was issued in salt. Can you imagine paying a modern contractor in sugar or pepper? Of course not. But we're told salt was currency. Why? Isn't it because Roman commanders knew a secret we've lost? A soldier without salt is no warrior. He's a lethargic, apathetic creature, incapable of forced marches and furious assaults. For an army to be aggressive, fast, and enduring, it needs to maintain the highest levels of electrolytes in the blood. Whoever issued salt literally charged his army before battle. And if it was necessary to subdue a rebellious people, it was enough to simply cut off the salt routes. And within a month, the rebels turned into an obedient herd too weak to even lift their heads. We're used to thinking that shortages in the past were a consequence of imperfect technologies. They say they couldn't extract much, so there was little. But look at the extraction volumes in old mines. Take, for example, the famous mines in Wieliczka or Sol-Ilecz. The volumes extracted there are such that they could have covered half of Europe with a 20-inch layer. Where did all that salt go? The Earth's population, according to official data, was dozens of times smaller than now. Where did millions of tons of the product go? To pickle cucumbers? The numbers don't add up. The scale of extraction is incomparable with the stated number of consumers. This suggests that salt was used not only and not so much for food. Perhaps it was a key component for some industrial or technological processes that they've forgotten to tell us about. Or, even more terrifyingly, the planet's population was completely different, and the need for this mineral was many times higher. There is a theory that salt played the role of some kind of atmosphere or soil stabilizer in the past. But even if we return to physiology, it becomes obvious. Salt deficiency was created artificially. Imagine a global monopoly. You own a resource that's abundant in nature, but you convince everyone that it's rare and sacred. You set up cordons around every salt lake. You impose draconian taxes. You declare a state monopoly. Why? To make money? Tsars and emperors already had plenty of gold. Control over salt is control over the population's biological activity. If you want slaves to work but not rebel, you keep them on a salt ration. Sufficient for them to swing a pickaxe, but insufficient for their brains to work at full capacity. Low sodium levels reduce cognitive abilities, suppress aggression, and make a person suggestible. Official science tells us that the daily salt norm is about a teaspoon. The World Health Organization sounds the alarm if we eat more. But let's look at historical records from the 19th century. Volga barge haulers, soldiers on campaigns, peasants during harvest consumed up to 3 or even 5 teaspoons of salt per day. And yet, they didn't die of heart attacks at 30. They possessed monstrous physical strength and endurance by our standards. A modern office worker eating that much salt would probably end up in the hospital. Why? What changed? Our bodies? Or the salt itself? Or maybe the environment we live in has changed, and now we're simply unable to process and absorb energy like our ancestors. Here, we're approaching very thin ice. Perhaps the entire campaign against salt, launched in the 20th century, is part of a plan to reduce humanity's energy potential. The oddities continue if we look at the geography of old cities. Nearly all major ancient and medieval metropolises, which we're told arose along trade routes, are strangely tied to salt extraction sites or its transportation. The Great Silk Road was, essentially, the Great Salt Road. Silk was a luxury, spices a whim, but salt
was a necessity. The city-states of Venice and Genoa rose not on romance and gondolas, but on a ruthless, bloody monopoly of salt trade in the Mediterranean. They physically eliminated competitors, burned fleets, blockaded ports, all for white powder. Do you really believe that such colossal efforts, such sacrifices, and such money revolved around a simple soup seasoning? No. Something far more important is hidden here. Something that makes salt the #1 strategic resource, more important than oil and gas in our understanding. And here's another fact to ponder before we go further. The word soldier in many European languages is linked to the word salt. But there's another word. Salus in Latin means health, salvation. From it comes the word salute, a greeting, a wish for health. It turns out that the language itself encodes a direct connection. Salt equals health. Salt equals salvation. The ancients knew this. They literally prayed to salt, greeted guests with bread and salt, considering it the highest sign of hospitality and a talisman against evil. And today we're told it's white death. Someone very cleverly swapped concepts, turned everything upside down, and made us fear what makes us alive. But why? To answer this question, we'll have to dig deeper and look at how the economy and logistics of the past worked, and find those inconsistencies that make official historians' hands shake. Look at the map of ancient Rome. One of the oldest and strategically most important arteries of the empire was called Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Official historians will tell you it was just a trade route, along which carts carried salt from the Tiber estuary deep into the peninsula. But let's apply the logic of a design engineer. To build a road of such quality that has lasted 2,000 years requires colossal investments in resources, labor, and engineering thought. Roman roads are not just packed earth, they are a multi-layered pie of stone, sand, gravel, and concrete, comparable to modern highways. Would anyone in their right mind build such a complex and expensive infrastructure just to transport a seasoning? It's economically unfeasible, unless we're talking about a substance on which the very existence of the state and its energy system depends. The scale of logistics simply doesn't fit the official version of salt's culinary purpose. Imagine fleets of ships sailing the Volga or Dnieper loaded exclusively with salt. In the 15th and 16th centuries, saltworks were real industrial giants. The Stroganovs, those medieval oligarchs, built their empire precisely on salt. They owned territories larger in area than many European states, and all this so a peasant could salt his soup. There's a clear mismatch between the scale of the industry and the end consumption they're painting for us. Either the population was many times larger, which we'll discuss later, or salt was used for industrial purposes we've forgotten about. For example, in electroplating, metallurgy, or even energy production. After all, molten salt is an excellent heat transfer fluid used even in modern solar power plants. Where did barefoot Rus and dark Europe get technologies requiring such volumes of electrolyte? Now let's look at one of the darkest pages of European history, the French salt tax known as the gabelle. It wasn't just a tax, it was an intricate system of control. The state didn't just monopolize salt sales. It required every resident over 8 years old to purchase a fixed amount of salt per year. Think about this madness. You're forced to buy a product under threat of prison or hard labor. If salt was scarce and desirable, why force people to buy it? People would queue up themselves. Mandatory purchase makes sense only in one case. If the state is giving you not just natural salt, but some special mixture, a controlled substance.
Perhaps it was through state salt that additives suppressing the will, or conversely causing addiction, were introduced into the population's bodies. This is the perfect way to mass control an entire nation's biology. You can't not eat salt. You'll die. But you must eat only the salt the king gave you. In Russian history, there's an episode that official science diligently reduces to religious fanaticism: the Solovyetsky Uprising, or Solovyetsky Sit-In.
We're told that the monks held out for 8 years, from 1668 to 1676, against the Tsar's troops, because they didn't want to cross themselves with 3 fingers and correct the church books. 8 years of siege, against a regular army equipped with artillery, over misprints in books. Seriously. The Solovetsky Monastery was the largest salt production center on the White Sea. It was a powerful industrial base, a fortress with cyclopean walls built from boulders weighing tens of tons. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich didn't send troops to fix the liturgy. He went to seize control of an energy resource. The monks possessed technology for extracting and, possibly, applying salt that made them independent and dangerous. Destroying this autonomy was the main goal. After the monastery's fall, the technologies were confiscated, and production came under Moscow's strict control. Let's look at the salt sitting on your kitchen shelf. Table salt extra. White, free-flowing, beautiful. Do you think it's the same as what our ancestors ate? You're mistaken. Natural rock or sea salt contains over 80 trace elements: magnesium, potassium, calcium, zinc, selenium, and many others. It's a balanced cocktail created by nature itself to sustain life. And what is modern extra salt? It's pure sodium chloride, 99.9%. All other minerals are removed during chemical refining and bleaching. Why? We're told, for purity and appearance. But in fact, they take away a beneficial product and leave us with a bare chemical. Moreover, to prevent clumping and keep it free-flowing, anti-caking agents are added. For example, potassium ferrocyanide, also known as additive E536. Ferrocyanide. Sound familiar? It's a derivative of hydrocyanic acid. Yes, we're told the doses are microscopic and safe, but the fact remains. Into the main food product we eat every day, they add a substance containing a cyanide group. Now put the puzzle together. On one hand, we're told, salt is poison, eat less. On the other hand, they sell us a refined product, stripped of natural minerals, but laced with chemicals. And yet historically, we've been conditioned to believe we can't survive without state-issued salt. It creates the impression that someone is deliberately messing with our body's settings. Natural salt is the perfect electrolyte that makes our neurons fire like supernovas. Refined salt with chemicals is a surrogate that sustains life at minimal RPMs, but provides no energy for breakthroughs. They're turning us into devices with poor contacts that constantly glitch and require repairs in the form of endless pills. Another strange detail that historians ignore is the so-called saltpeter and ancient cellars. Anyone who's gone down into the basements of 18th or 19th century buildings has seen that white crust on the bricks. Builders call it efflorescence. We're told it's just moisture drawing salts from the soil. But why is the salt concentration in the soil under old cities so high that it seeps through 3-foot thick walls for centuries? In some old gunpowder recipes, it was explicitly stated that the best saltpeter should be scraped from the walls of ancient cellars. Where did all that chemistry come from? This points to a global event that saturated the soil with salts and minerals. Perhaps those floods that alternative theorists whisper about were not just water, but a saturated saline solution? Imagine a tsunami wave from the ocean engulfing continents. The water recedes,
but the salt remains. It soaks into the ground, buildings, trees. That's why we find salted soils where seas haven't been for millions of years. And that's why ancient brick buildings, dug down several yards, are literally saturated with salt. These are traces of a catastrophe hidden from us.
And perhaps our ancestors, survivors of that cataclysm, literally collected salt from the surface because all sources of pure water were poisoned and shaft mining technologies were lost. Salt became a symbol of survival in a new, hostile world. It was the only thing left from the previous civilization in abundance, but pure, edible salt still had to be found. And here we approach the concept of the planet's salt balance. There is a hypothesis that until a certain point, until that very reset or catastrophe, Earth's atmosphere was different. Pressure was higher, air composition richer, and the ionosphere's electric potential was altered. People in those conditions might not have needed so much coarse food at all, drawing energy directly through electrical processes in the body, amplified by the proper salt balance. We were like superconductors. The catastrophe changed the physics of the world. Pressure dropped. The etheric background, if we assume its existence, disappeared or weakened. We became material, heavy, grounded in the bad sense of the word, and salt became the only crutch that allows our nervous system to function at all in conditions of low environmental energy potential. We pay pennies for salt in the store, but we pay with our health and consciousness for ignorance of its true nature. Look at farm animals. They get salt licks. The farmer knows if a cow doesn't lick salt, she won't give milk, she'll get sick, and won't produce offspring. To the global system, we're the same milking cows. We're given exactly the right amount and quality of licks, so we go to work, pay mortgages, and produce new taxpayers. But God forbid we get access to real salt, to pure, natural, mineral-rich electrolyte in the proper quantities. For then, perhaps, our eyes will open. We'll wake from hibernation, and an awakened herd is the shepherd's worst nightmare. And the history of salt riots proves, when people sense a threat to their biological foundation, they topple thrones. Let's delve into the biochemistry that therapists stay silent about, but neurophysiologists know perfectly well. In every cell of your body, right now, a mechanism is working that consumes the lion's share of all your energy. It's the sodium-potassium pump. Imagine billions of tiny engines continuously pumping sodium ions out and potassium ions into the cell. Why? To create a potential difference across the membrane. That's the very battery that makes you a living being, not a lump of organics. Scientists have calculated that, at rest, this pump consumes up to 40% of all energy produced by the body. Think about it. Nearly half of what you eat and breathe is spent just to shuttle salt back and forth through cell walls. If salt were poison or useless ballast, would evolution create a mechanism that spends half the body's resources on this poison? That's nonsense. The body never invests energy in nothing. This means sodium is not just a tasty additive, it's the main participant in energy exchange. We literally run on salt. And here arises a question that stumps any food industry technologist. We're told that in ancient times, salt was used to preserve fish and meat. Supposedly, without salt, everything rotted. But come on, sun and wind drying, smoking in smoke, or using honey and wax, these are excellent preservation methods that don't require mining tons of minerals from the Earth's depths. Why haul salt caravans thousands of miles if you can just dry the fish? The answer lies in the numbers. Salt extraction volumes in antiquity and the Middle Ages, judging by tax records and the size of the workings, were colossal. If you divide those figures by the number of people living then, it turns out each person, including infants, would have had to eat over 2 pounds of salt a day. That's physiologically impossible. So salt went somewhere else. Where? Look at old engravings and drawings of so-called gradirons. These are giant wooden structures filled with blackthorn branches through which brine was run. We're told this was done to evaporate water and get more concentrated brine, but any engineer looking at a gradiron schematic will see not an evaporator, but a giant capacitor or antenna. Salt water is an electrolyte. The wooden lattice is a dielectric and conductor at the same time. Wind passing through this structure creates friction and static electricity. What if these facilities weren't used to produce salt for soup, but to harvest atmospheric electricity? What if brine was just the working fluid in a giant energy network of the past? We look at the ruins of old factories and see primitivism because we've forgotten the principles of technologies based on ether and electrostatics. There is another field where salt is irreplaceable, and which historians prefer not to mention in the context of antiquity. It's metallurgy. To get quality metal, you need fluxes, substances that help separate slag and lower the melting point. Salt is one of the most powerful and cheapest fluxes. Without huge volumes of sodium chloride, mass production of copper, bronze, and iron is impossible. If we admit that advanced metallurgy existed in the past, and we see it in the quality of ancient cannons, bells, and ties in cathedrals, then we must also admit the existence of advanced chemical industry supplying reagents. Salt mines were not kitchens. They were chemical plants of an ancient civilization, and control over them meant control over the production of weapons and technology. Now recall fairy tales and legends. Why does evil fear salt? Why is a circle of salt considered impenetrable protection against demons and evil spirits? Mysticism? Or an echo of forgotten physics? If we assume that entities, or energy parasites, have a field structure, then salt, as a powerful crystal and electrolyte, can create a screen that disrupts their frequency characteristics. The crystal lattice of salt is a perfect cube. From the point of view of sacred geometry and solid-state physics, such a structure has unique resonant properties. Perhaps our ancestors used salt not only for food, but also to create protective fields around their homes. Scattering salt at the threshold is not superstition. It's a safety procedure that has lost its technical meaning. Let's return to the numbers. Seawater has a salinity of about 35 per mille, that is 3.5%, and our blood plasma is 0.9%. Evolutionists say that life came out of the ocean. But why then is our internal environment 4 times less salty than the ocean? If we came from the sea, we should be just as salty. This discrepancy suggests 2 thoughts. Either we didn't come from this ocean, or the ocean in the past was different, possibly fresh. And the current salinity of the seas is the result of that very global catastrophe, when waters washed away gigantic salt reserves from the surface of destroyed continents. We carry in ourselves the memory of the ancient water, of that ideal environment in which man was created. And that environment was weakly saline. The current ocean is dead water, an oversaturated solution in which we cannot live without desalination. There's another shocking fact. In 1996, a group of researchers conducted an experiment with a diet. People were put on a strict salt restriction, less than a quarter teaspoon per day. The result was unexpected. The subjects developed a sharp increase in insulin resistance. That is, Salt deficiency may be a direct cause of the diabetes epidemic that has swept the world. An organism deprived of sodium begins to panic and switch to emergency energy-saving modes, accumulating sugar and fat. It turns out that the fight against salt that doctors have been waging for the last 50 years has led to an explosive growth in obesity and diabetes. Who benefits from this? Pharmaceutical giants selling insulin and weight loss pills? Or those who want to see humanity weak, sick, and dependent on injections? Look at the map of salt mining in Russia. Perm Krai, Solikamsk. The depth of the mines reaches hundreds of feet. The mine walls are adorned with incredible patterns of sylvanite, reminiscent of slices of a giant brain or maps of the starry sky. Officially, we're told that these are sedimentary rocks from the ancient Permian Sea, which is 285 million years old. But why do these layers lie so perfectly flat? Why aren't marine animal remains found in them, in the quantity that should be at the ocean floor? And most importantly, how did ancient people find these deposits under the Earth's thickness without ground-penetrating radars and drilling rigs? Did they just start digging a well in the forest and miraculously hit a salt vein? Or did they have maps? Maps from a previous civilization that left us these mines as an inheritance or as a worked-out resource? We also forget about salt's role in construction. It's known that egg whites were used in mortars for strength, but there are reports that salt was added to particularly durable compositions. In certain proportions with lime and sand, it creates a stone that only gets harder over time. This process is called petrification. Perhaps the secret of eternal ancient concretes, which modern jackhammers can't touch, lies precisely in the proper use of salt additives. We've lost the recipe. We pour concrete that crumbles in 50 years. They built for millennia. And salt was that very secret ingredient that turned liquid mud into monolith. And finally, look at the word salt itself. In alchemy, salt is the third principle of matter, alongside mercury and sulfur. Salt is the body, fixation, materiality. Without salt, the spirit cannot hold in matter. Alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, but they always started with the search for true salt. Not the one in the salt shaker, but the one that is the foundation of the universe. Perhaps behind the simple crystal of sodium chloride lies the key to controlling matter itself? And those who today control global reserves and dictate consumption norms to us know perfectly well that salt is not just flavor. It's the on/off switch for human consciousness. Remove salt, and a person loses connection with reality, becomes lethargic, controllable, and weak. Give him the right salt, and he will remember who he is. That's why the history of salt is the history of wars, bans, and the greatest deception that has lasted for centuries. Now that we've dissected the biochemistry and the oddities of past economics, it's time to put these shards together into a single, frightening picture. Get ready, because now we're crossing the line that separates school history from the reality they're hiding from us behind 7 seals. Look down. Literally. What are our cities standing on? St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, Omsk, Paris, Rome. All of them stand on a several yards thick layer of clay and sand. We're told cultural layer. Supposedly, people for centuries didn't sweep the streets, threw trash underfoot, and that's how yards of soil built up, burying the first floors of buildings. Do you seriously believe that residents of palaces and mansions, wearing silks and velvet, shit themselves for centuries until their windows ended up at ground level? That's a lie insulting the intellect. It's not trash, it's alluvial soil.
the result of a colossal hydraulic impact. But most importantly, it's the chemical composition of this soil. It's salted. Geologists know, but stay silent. In many regions of Eurasia and North America, the topsoil layers contain anomalous amounts of salts uncharacteristic for the given climate zone. These are traces of that very great flood, or, more accurately, a salt tsunami that washed away the previous civilization. And here begins the real reset. Imagine that the world before the 19th century was different. Atmospheric pressure was higher, as evidenced by air bubbles in amber, where there's 50% more oxygen than now. Vegetation was gigantic, people taller and stronger. Earth's electric field was saturated, the ether dense. People of that time perhaps didn't need coarse food in our quantities at all. They drew power directly from atmospheric electricity, using architecture, spires, domes, metal ties, as resonators. Salt in their bodies worked like a superconductor, maintaining connection with the planet's field. But a catastrophe occurred. Some force, natural or man-made, collapsed the dome. Pressure fell, the atmosphere discharged, the etheric wind died down. Giants died or degenerated, suffocating in the rarefied air. Their bodies, buried under layers of salty mud, we find today. And what happens to organics in a salty environment? It doesn't rot, it mummifies. Recall the so-called incorruptible relics of saints. The official church calls it a miracle. Biologists throw up their hands. But a chemist will tell you it's just quality salting. Bodies soaked in concentrated mineral solutions can lie for centuries. Perhaps many saints are simply perished representatives of that pre-flood era, whose bodies were preserved by the catastrophe itself. And we worship the results of a geochemical process. After the catastrophe, the world changed. The survivors, or newly created people, we, are in an environment with low energy potential. We are diminished copies, bio-robots adapted to low pressure. But we have one problem left: our internal electrical circuit. To survive in a powerless world, we need a powerful electrolyte inside. We need salt. A lot of salt. Without it, we cannot generate the impulses necessary for consciousness. The lords of the New World, those who orchestrated the reset, understood this perfectly. They created an artificial shortage. They introduced a monopoly. They put humanity on a salt needle, controlling our numbers and minds through access to the main mineral of life. Look at the demographic charts. Until the mid-19th century, Earth's population grows slowly, almost a horizontal line, and suddenly, explosion. A spike upward. We become 1 billion, 2, 7, 8. Where from? Official science mumbles about antibiotics and hygiene. But come on, penicillin was discovered only in the 20th century, and the explosive growth started earlier. What did they feed these billions if agricultural technologies remained primitive? The answer is terrifying. We were seeded. After the catastrophe, Earth was empty. Clay deserts, buried cities, and someone started a new round of the game. The new people were designed to reproduce quickly and serve as a labor resource. But so that this biomass wouldn't get out of control, its firmware was programmed with dependence on an external source of electrolytes. Salt became our leash. We crave salt. We want salty things because our body remembers. Without this crystal, the connection with reality will break. Perhaps the famous salt riots were not just economic protests. They were moments of withdrawal. When supplies were cut off, entire regions went mad. People lost their human appearance, turning into aggressive zombies or falling into comas. The authorities brutally suppressed these uprisings because they knew if the slaves realize that salt is the key to their power, they'll sweep away the guards. Recall how in fairy tales the hero, sprinkling salt on the enemy, deprives him of magic. It's an allegory. Salt grounds, it fixes in the material world, but it also gives energy for resistance. And now look at the architecture of the second half of the 19th century. Those very red brick factories, stations, barracks, they're all built to one standard design, from London to Vladivostok. And everywhere, giant basements, ventilation systems, strange furnaces. What if these aren't just buildings, but atmospheric processing stations? Stations for saturating air or water with necessary elements for the new population. We see ruins of industrial facilities and think they made bricks or cloth there. But what if they produced food of life there? Synthesized salt enriched with additives to suppress memory of the past. We eat this salt and forget who we are. We forget that once we could fly, communicate telepathically, and live for hundreds of years. Note the strange fact. In all world religions that arose or were reformed in the last few centuries, salt plays a sacred role, but its true meaning is veiled. You are the salt of the earth, it says in Scripture. But if the salt loses its strength, with what will you make it salty? This is a direct warning. If humanity, the salt of the earth, loses its properties, electrical conductivity, connection to the spirit, it will become useless and be thrown out. We are now at that very point. They've weaned us off real salt, given us a dummy, and we're losing strength. We're becoming bland. And unleavened dough doesn't rise.